Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your interest. Thanks to Kevin for the introduction. As he explained, I come to the issue of Ukraine as an anti-war activist. That's what got me concerned about what I saw taking place there. Beginning in late 2013, and I began to write extensively about the situation in March of 2014, and I made my first trip to the region in July of 2014. I went to attended an anti-war conference in Crimea, and then I spent a week in Crimea at that time, and then I went to Moscow for 1 week after that to follow up those discussions. And two of my colleagues who were at that conference in the Alpha Crimea are here with us today, and I very much look forward to their participation in the discussion. Radhika Desai, who's a professor at the University of Manitoba, and Alan Freeman, who also resides in Winnipeg. And we've been working together, the three of us, along with a whole network of colleagues internationally to oppose the war in Ukraine and try and tell the truth as we see it of what's taking place. I spoke here in Ottawa once before, and this was last August, following the visit to Crimea and Moscow, and I was very fortunate, and we were all very fortunate at that time, to meet my colleague who's joining me here on the platform today, Halyna. And Halyna and I have been working very closely since then, and it's certainly been a very rewarding experience for me because of her expertise as a Ukrainian and as someone like all of us deeply concerned about the war situation. So what I'm going to do today is present you an overview of the situation. I am going to talk about what has originally been placed as the my key theme on what exactly is the character of modern day Russia. But I'm going to provide you with a bit of an overview, not assume that you know all of the recent history of what we're talking about. This was our travel there in mid-April. We flew from Moscow to Rostov-on-Don in Russia on April 13th, and then the next day traveled to Donetsk along the route that you see. Along the way, we stopped at Primorka, which is a small town in the Rostov region of Russia, to visit with war refugees from the Donbass region of Ukraine, who have safely relocated there, awaiting the fate of their homeland. And I'll tell you a little bit about that visit across the border, and then arrived in Donetsk city. And then we spent 2 full days in Donetsk city in and around there, and then made the return trip on April 17th. So 2 full days in Donetsk and 4 full days in the region, and we learned a great deal. The red line I've drawn here is roughly the ceasefire line, and you'll see that in a few more maps that I have, and it's useful for you to know the map. That's the ceasefire. That was the second ceasefire that's been agreed to in eastern Ukraine, this one on February 12th. And so you see the ceasefire line really passes just on the outskirts of the city limits of Donetsk, and specifically close to the airport of Donetsk, which has been destroyed by the Ukrainian army during the course of the war in 2014. And there I've drawn the ceasefire line again for you on the right-hand side. You see what a relatively small part of the territory of Ukraine that we're talking about. So if there's a full-scale invasion of Russia going on in Ukraine today, as many Western media outlets, as well as Western government leaders would have us believe, or some variant of a large-scale invasion by Russia, it's a rather unimpressive performance by the Russian army. But of course, we argue that there's nothing of the case taking place, and what we're seeing actually is an invasion of eastern Ukraine by a government in Kiev against its own population. But again, you'll see how this is my rough drawing, approximate drawing of the ceasefire line, but it's really on the very outskirts of the city limits of Donetsk. And importantly, the ceasefire line, when you come down to the sea of Azov, the city of Mariupol is on the Ukrainian side of the ceasefire line, and that's been an important issue. And here you have a more close-up view of the territory controlled by what I call the pro-autonomy forces of eastern Ukraine. That is, people who do not want to live under a neoconservative, pro-European austerity government. This is the source of the conflict in Ukraine. And so this is the military standoff that's been reached approximately over the past 10 months. So Primorka camp that we visited has about, I think it's about 500 residents there. 350. 350. Mostly women and children, because the men of the families are either remaining in Donetsk, some are volunteers in the self-defense forces, or men have gone and found employment in Russia, which is fairly easy to do if you're a skilled Ukrainian worker. So we spent a good solid 4 hours talking to people, and this was very important, really profound experience for all of us to really get a sense of how the people of Eastern Ukraine feel about what's taking place. And both Halyna and I have written articles, trying to convey what the people of this camp told us about their feelings of this war, how it's happened, how they feel about the 25 or 24 years that they lived in an independent Ukraine, and their feelings for the future. So it was extremely informative for us all around. And I'll invite you to go and read our articles, which summarize our talks here with the folks in the village, and as I said, their outlook on the future. I mentioned the children there who are in school. People are, living as well as could be expected in a war refugee situation. Certainly, well taken care of by the emergency affairs ministry of the Russian government. And then we arrived at Donetsk city, which is a very beautiful city. And we were pleased to see that the center of the city is not that much affected by all of the shelling and bombings and mortars that have characterized this war over the past, more than a year now. Incidentally, in the little mountain that you see in the background is one of the many slag heaps. This is the leftovers from coal mining, which are actually quite bad environmentally for the region, and one of the many tasks that should be getting tackled today, throughout Ukraine instead of the war. It's tackling, for example, the pretty harsh environmental legacy of 150 years of industrialization of this region in particular, and Ukraine more generally. But that's something to note. Donetsk is a very beautiful city, and I think it's pretty typical of most of the cities of the former Soviet Union. There's a great attention paid to public art, to public space. I was very impressed. I mean, I certainly don't know of a Canadian city that could come close to Donetsk for the beauty of the public spaces and public art. This walkway is full of very attractive art displays throughout the gardens and so forth. This is our delegation meeting with the fellow in the center with the tie on is Boris Litvinov. He's the director of the budget committee of the government of the Donetsk People's Republic, and he gave us quite an interesting talk about their budgetary plans, because what's happening in the Donetsk People's Republic, as in Lugansk, is the government is getting on its feet. They're beginning to govern. I'll talk later of what it is exactly they're governing and what their aspirations are, but they're certainly on their feet in doing this. And this is our very strong impression throughout Donetsk of people in a government very much getting on their feet. And the two people on your left are the two deputies of the Novorossiya Parliament who accompanied us during the tour. Boris Litvinov, who's pictured here, is also the leader of the Donetsk Communist Party, which is a new party that's been formed distinct from the Ukrainian Communist Party for some very important contemporary reasons. And Halyna conducted an interview with him last November, which you can find in her collection of articles that are on the website of the New Cold War, Ukraine and Beyond. There's a whole author page there where all of her writings are compiled. And in the background you see the flag of the Donetsk People's Republic. And you'll find an interview with Alexander Kolesnik published yesterday in Counterpunch, and it's also on the New Cold War website. And it's a very informative interview for explaining the political outlook of many of the people like him in this part of Eastern Ukraine who hold to the vision of what they call a Novorossiya, historical region of what's now Ukraine, which has some distinct political aspirations that I'll describe later. In Donetsk, the 2 full days that we were there, we spent quite a bit of time getting out into the neighborhoods that are the most affected by the war. This is October district, which is close to the airport. We heard, as we were talking here, we hear the shelling falling, which was a bit new. They hadn't really had shelling happening coming in from the Ukrainian army during the daytime hours. So that was a bit new and unsettling for But we spent quite a bit of time talking to them and again writing up their experiences. They showed us the typical basement, not a bomb shelter, just the basement where people take refuge when the shelling comes uncomfortably close. And you know, this is literally where families, especially kids, during the worst of the fighting last summer, families were spending 24 hours in here with the children. So imagine the trauma of the children, leave alone the adults, living in these very, very harsh conditions. And you know, this is the typical damage you see to housing, well, throughout eastern Ukraine, but in this case, we're on the, as I said, we're on that kind of outskirt of Donetsk city, getting close to the airport. Very widespread, you know, direct shelling of residences, you know, what we call war crimes. The rest, it seems that much of the, well, all of the governments and media of the West have a hard time with that term to describe what Ukraine is doing, but it's certainly our description of what the Ukrainian government is doing against its own civilians in the east of the country. The worst damage we saw was actually outside of Donetsk. It's in the rural areas that surround the city. And actually this village, and I forget the name of it, it was a small agricultural village. It actually lies between Donetsk and the Russian border. So, you know, Donetsk was kind of getting encircled from behind. And this is where we saw the worst of the damage. Virtually every house, these are apartment buildings, you know, were damaged by shelling. So that was an eye-opener to see how extensive that was. And this is a woman who's, you know, doesn't yet have the financial or the material means to rebuild the house that was damaged in the worst of the war last summer. So this is, you know, a summary of the situation as we saw it. This has been a very harsh war that's cost the lives of many, many thousands of people. The official figure is 6,350 people. That's the latest figures from the United Nations, but the real figure is much, much higher. Several million people made refugee. The region of the country is completely traumatized and shattered. There is a ceasefire in place, but you know, the ceasefire is not stable. It is still in place, I believe, although there's been some very intensive fighting in the last couple of days as the forces in the Donetsk People's Republic try to neutralize the places from which the Ukrainian government continues to shell Donetsk and other parts of the country. But I'm not convinced yet, as some are writing, that the ceasefire is over and we're back into the war. I don't think we're there yet, and I'm hopeful that we're not there yet. And what we found among people is they're very angry at what's going on. They're angry at the Ukrainian government, of course, but they're angry at the world. This is Europe in 2015, and we have a government that's bombing its own civilians, shelling towns, workplaces, hospitals, schools, and you know, people just shake their heads, they can't believe it. Especially the older generation who actually lived through this. There's people young enough in Donetsk who lived the Second World War. They were 10 years, 12 years old, and we met them, and they said, we can't believe this is going on. We're going through this again. A nightmare like this was enough once in our lifetime. And of course, it's very hard. It's not just the shelling and the bombing that Kiev has been imposing. There's an economic blockade. There's there's serious interruption of aid shipments being conducted by Kiev, and Kiev cut off the pensions of the older people in the rebel regions last June. And there's been no source of income for these people to replace that, so they've been entirely dependent on humanitarian aid until just recently. And this was the shelling just in the past 10 days, so it's ongoing. The situation is not at all resolved. But we also, we saw some reasons for hope. Certainly, that's what we heard from the people in the region. They're very proud that they've been able to withstand this assault by Ukraine against them. They're proud that they've, established a government. There is, the beginnings of a functioning society and economy taking place in the region. That's rather impressive, given the scale of what they have they've suffered. And but they're in the middle of a war, so there's, the expectations are not excessive and high. And of course, there's many complicated problems of building, rebuilding, I should say, society that are there before them, including, as I hinted at the very bottom here, very substantial issues of how a democracy is going to function in whatever new forms of governing the region that are arrived at. But parallel to this, this war crisis in eastern Ukraine is a very profound social and economic the war crisis in the east of Ukraine is a very profound social and economic crisis throughout the whole of the country. Can't understate it enough. This is a country that's on the verge of, the government is on the verge of financial collapse. It depends entirely now on loans coming from the Western financial institutions and governments for its survival, including, this is where the money for waging its war is coming from. The national economy is in free fall because the source of this whole conflict has been this turn by the Ukrainian economic elite towards economic association with Europe. And that has very, very heavy consequences for these long-standing traditional economic ties with Russia. And so, as I cite here, the first 3 months of this year, commerce between Ukraine and Russia has dropped by 64%. That's catastrophic. That's hundreds of thousands of people without work anymore, factories closing, and a completely unknown future. Because this is not necessarily something short-term. Unless there's some negotiated resolution of this conflict, including on the economic front, then the future is extremely uncertain. And of course, all of this in the context where we see this resurgence of the extreme right in Ukraine, which is the extreme right is present in the government, it's present in the direction of the army of the country, and it's present in the direction of the police of the country. And there are serious attacks on democratic rights that are taking place across the board that are very, very substantive. We cover this on the website newcoldwar.org, and of course many other of the media colleagues who are publishing like we are. So the information is out there, and it's very substantial, including the use of some very specific violent assaults at key moments in this process, including the day before the overthrow of the elected president of Ukraine on February 21st, 2014. We're learning more and more of what's called the Sniper Massacre on Maidan Square, and also of the Odessa Massacre on May 2nd, when largely peaceful protesters against this right-wing neo-conservative government in Kiev were massacred. And in fact, the researcher who's doing the key research on that is right here at the University of Ottawa, Ivan Kachanowski, who's done some very groundbreaking research, very controversial research, including for him. And one other thing I'll note is the widespread opposition in Ukraine among the young men to military conscription. This is something the new right-wing government brought back in. The Yanukovych government abolished military conscription in 2013 because there was no war, to say the least. And that's something which this new government brought back in because mobilized the numbers that it thought was needed for the war. And this is extremely unpopular. And there are literally tens of thousands of young Ukrainian men who have fled the country. They've gone to Western Europe, they've gone to other countries in Eastern Europe, and many have gone to Russia, where they're officially welcome. There is a kind of an open door policy in Russia to young men including military conscription. You probably know roughly of the events in Maidan Square, the overthrow of the elected president on February 21st, 2014, which opened the door to a fundamental shift in the political direction of Ukraine. And over the course of time now, the rewriting of the history, where the extreme right of Ukraine, including that part of it which collaborated with Nazi Germany during World War II, are becoming, historically the national heroes of the country. It's a profound shift that's taking place at every level in Ukraine. It's economic relations with other countries, the social relations of the country, the role of the government in governing, and the very history of the country is being changed and rewritten as a result of the events in Ukraine. Now, I believe very strongly that this choice that's been forced on the Ukrainian government by this new right-wing government, by the extreme right of Ukraine, and by the European government is a completely false choice to be imposing on a country. It's as if someone were to come to Canada and say, okay, your future economically here, you have two choices. You can either associate with the United States, or you can associate with, well, whatever it be, Europe, maybe Asia, but that's your choice. It's not both. You can't have a rounded economy. You must make a sharp choice here. And whatever choice you make is going to have very harsh consequences for you, but that's your choice. It's absurd that a country like Ukraine that is so, integrated to a whole regional economy of Europe, including Russia, to have such a choice forced on it, but that's been what's taking place. This is my view of, what this Maidan or Euro-Maidan movement was. It was a multi-class movement of protests that had a lot of very conflicting elements to it. There was an element of genuine sort of frustration and with the whole course of the country since independence, and specifically since the Orange Revolution of 2004-05, which was supposed to solve many of the economic problems of Ukraine, solve many of the problems of the absence of democracy, the domination of the economic elite, what they call oligarchs over the country, and so forth. So, you know, a lot of very authentic and genuine, you know, protest against that, but mixed in with some very, very different political forces as well. You know, a large section of the Ukrainian economic elite who wanted to make this sharp turn to Europe with the conditions that Europe was imposing. Because Europe wasn't saying, have an association with us, and meanwhile, you know, carry on as you like with Russia. No, it's us or them. There's your choice. And of course, a turn to not the Europe of the social democratic 1950s, 60s, 70s, whatever, you know, one can judge that to have been worth, certainly better than the Europe of today. But no, this is the Europe of austerity. This is the Europe that's given Greece what it has, that we are rather familiar with, and so forth. And then, you know, extremely important in all this is the very forceful intervention by the extreme right of Ukraine in these events. And so in response to the changeover in Kiev was the rise of what was called the Russian Spring, a peaceful, and I stress that, a peaceful protest movement in its origin in April. People in the East basically emulating what they saw in Kiev. Okay, they don't like the government, they don't like what's going on, we do the same. We'll occupy government buildings and put forward demands for what we want. And so, you know, the Russian Spring movement, unfortunately, was obliged to turn to self-defense against the violent response that was imposed upon them, what's called the anti-Paris operation by the Kiev government. These were the key demands of the Russian Spring, eminently reasonable demands, really demanding sort of a constitutional setup for Ukraine, for example, not a lot different than what Canada has. Provincial governments, or regional governments in their case, with substantial powers and so forth. But all of this was refused by force and violence. There were two places in Ukraine that were successful in repelling the force and violence that the new right-wing government in Kiev sought to oppose. And one of them was Crimea. And I don't have time to, you know, discuss it through, but I made notes here, which the simple history of Crimea, I think, explains it all. What happened in Crimea in March of 2014, I believe, was an exercise in political self-determination, and which flowed from a very troubling and conflict-filled history of Crimea within Ukraine, beginning in 1954, an administrative decision in 1954 to attach Crimea to Ukraine. I think, well, certainly the best article that I wrote in summarizing all of this, and most specifically the 25 years of conflict in independent Ukraine that were never successfully resolved for Crimeans. They were always dissatisfied with this relationship that they had with Ukraine. And so this is not a new problem. The idea that all of a sudden, you know, Ukraine's history begins in Crimea's history and its relationship to Ukraine begins in February 2014, you know, is sort of typical media play, but it's, you know, in fact, there's a deep and underlying political conflict here. And so, so this was the one region of what was then Ukraine that was able to successfully repel the civil war that Kiev has imposed on anyone who opposes the neoconservative turn. And they did so with almost no violence. And of course, you know, as we know, Russia had a great interest in facilitating this process, but I do not believe in the slightest that we're talking of a Russian annexation of Crimea. This was a decision by the Crimean people that was facilitated by Russia for sure, for lots of national interests that Russia had. Ukraine's a very complicated place politically and ethnically and linguistically. I think it's one of its great contributions to human society today. This is a wonderful example of how people of different languages, histories, and nationalities can come together and form a vibrant country. But it's not without difficulties. There's intense complications in this country, linguistically and historically and otherwise, that you see in a few of these charts. Now, of course, I'm talking here of languages. These charts rather show the languages spoken at home. This is not an ethnic, description of Ukraine. But it does show the intense multinational and multilingual character of the country, where speaking Russian and Ukrainian doesn't have the same sort of context as today. The issue of speaking English or French has us laden with historical conflict, and it's a different situation in Ukraine altogether. And incidentally, these linguistic numbers and percentages correspond roughly to the politics of the country as well. The people in the center, south and the east of the country, in their majority vote one way, and the people in the center and the west vote another way. It happens to overlap with language, but this is not a linguistic divide. This is a political divide with linguistic and historical overtones and so forth. And so I call Ukraine a very multinational, multilingual country, has an intense sort of internationalism in the spirit, and many of its people, especially in the east of the country. It's a fascinating place. And it's a place that is still suffering and enduring national oppression. But the locus of this national oppression has shifted over the last 25 years. And nothing could show that clearer today in Ukraine than the fact that you have an American-born financier who's the Minister of Finance. The national government of Ukraine has essentially turned the country over to the international financial institutions and to the large governments of Europe and North America. So this is a government which is really, it's ceding the sovereignty of the country. It's a huge concern to the Ukrainian people themselves. And this is one last map. We'll just show you again, coming back to the complexity of the country. This is how Ukraine came together for the first time as an independent country in 1918, under the impulse of the Russian Revolution, which had a very profoundly progressive self-determination thrust to the Russian Revolution, a profoundly progressive appreciation of the importance of respect for language and nationalities, and that's why they were able to forge a successful multinational and multilingual country, overcoming the divisions and so forth. This alone is a fascinating topic, how the country of Ukraine came together in these years, and this decision of people of different nationalities and histories, and different relations with the different empires of the region. But alas, I don't have time to go into that. I'm going to end with what was supposed to be the theme of my talk, but really I regard the talk here as opening up a discussion that we need to have, and I hope scholars here and elsewhere can do a lot more of the research that I think needs to be done. I don't think enough is being done, and one of those is on this topic of what exactly Russia is today. I think that there's a deeply mistaken view that's argued that today's Russia is what's called imperialist, and I don't think that Russia meets that definition. And I've written here 6 arguments which you can take some time to look at later, hopefully in the film broadcast of this, because I don't have time to go through these. But I think each of them by themselves is quite compelling, and when you put the package together, what you arrive at is a country that's very different than the large imperialist countries of the world, the US, Germany, Japan, and so forth. Now Russia is a capitalist country, so some people mistakenly think, because I argue that Russia doesn't at all fit the description of these large imperialist countries, that somehow I'm saying, well, this is now it's a progressive type of country that's different progressively. No, but I think that the existence of Russia and the poly nature of the world economy today, where countries like Russia that are capitalists but not imperialists can have an independent existence and can carve out an independent existence vis-a-vis the large imperialist countries, has profound implications for the people of the world. In Latin America, for example, they're not beholden anymore entirely to the economy of the United States. They have options for their political future. And this is just one of the many consequences of having a proper analysis of Russia and the world. We don't have this knee-jerk phraseology. And in the case of Ukraine, this terribly destructive view, which says that what you have in Ukraine is 2 imperialist powers fighting it out over this country, Russia on the one hand, the United States and NATO and Europe on the other. That's a terribly misleading and confusing way of understanding what's going on in Ukraine, because in this particular case, Russia's actions in the face of the NATO and the European Union and the United States political offensive have been defensive in character. Does that mean that Russia is, as I said earlier, all of a sudden this is a progressive power in Europe? Well, no, but we have to look at each circumstance very specifically. And lastly, on point 6, I think this is a really understudied question. What changed in the world after 1945? Probably the most fundamental thing is that the imperialist countries realized they can't run the world anymore with this intense competition going on. They almost lost their world twice through 2 world wars. And so they've constructed an entire apparatus of a kind of a consensus rule where, yes, they compete and they have their differences and so forth, but they don't enter into these destructive wars against each other. Show me something in the slightest bit comparable on the side of Russia with its political and economic alliances similar to NATO. It doesn't exist. So, we're talking about trying to understand the whole world as it's evolved since 1945. That's what underlies this issue of what Russia is and what it's becoming. So I'm going to put this up on the screen later, and I don't have time to go into it, but I think that, these are the 3 options probably that we're likely, that are going to play out, and different parts of them are going to play out with a different focus at different times. But the thing I want to stress here that we learned in Donetsk is this term separatist, or separatism, to describe the ambitions of the people in eastern Ukraine is terribly destructive and misleading, because the people of Ukraine are not separatists. They are fighting for democracy, against austerity, for a social economy, and they're fighting against this Ukraine that they've known and lived with, which is controlled and dominated by the economic elite, the so-called oligarchs. So what does that mean politically for the future? Well, this is what we learned in Donetsk. People are saying, well, we'll see. If we can get some progressive change going on in Ukraine, we can live with that. We can live in a federation with Ukraine. If we continue to have a war against us, well, yeah, we can't be part of a country and a government that makes war on us. All options are open. And interestingly, one of the reasons why this is such an intense debate in Donetsk is that Russia has made it very clear, contrary to all the propaganda that you read, is Russia's not, won't accept Eastern Ukraine into the Russian Federation, which of course many people in Eastern Ukraine really regret. They really wish this could be done, but that's the reality that we're faced with. So, I think it's an extremely, interesting, but also complicated and convoluted situation. We don't know at all what the end result is, but we know for sure that these labels that falsely describe, in advance what, the goals and the ambitions of people are terribly destructive. Terribly destructive, and we really need to push back against this simplistic labeling of the struggle. So I'm going to end there, and I look very much forward to hearing Halyna, because it's the first time we've been able to talk, and I look forward to your questions and comments during the discussion.